The Fate of Vashti by Ginzberg. Though Ahasuerus had taken every precaution to prevent intemperate indulgence in wine, his banquet revealed the essential difference between Jewish and pagan festivities. When Jews are gathered about a festal board, they discuss a halakha, or a haggadah, or, at the least, a simple verse from the scriptures. Ahasuerus and his boon companions rounded out the banquet with prurient talk. The Persians lauded the charms of the women of their people, while the Medians admitted none superior to the Median women. Then the fool Ahasuerus up and spake, "My wife is neither a Persian nor a Median, but a Chaldean, yet she excels all in beauty. Would you convince yourselves of the truth of my words?" "Yes," shouted the company who were deep in their cups, "but that we may properly judge of her natural charms, let her appear before us unadorned, yes, without any apparel whatsoever." And Ahasuerus agreed to the shameless condition. 31. The thing was from God, that so insensate a demand should be made of Vashti by the king. A whole week Mordecai had spent in fasting and praying, supplicating God to mete out punishment to Ahasuerus for his desecration of the temple utensils. On the 7th day of the week, on the Sabbath, when Mordecai after his long fast took food, because fasting is forbidden on the Sabbath day, God heard his prayer and the prayer of the Sanhedrin. 32. He sent down 7 angels of confusion to put an end to Ahasuerus's pleasure. They were named Mehuman, confusion; Biztha, destruction of the house; Harbana, annihilation; Bigtha and Abagtha, the pressers of the winepress. For God had resolved to crush the court of Ahasuerus as one presses the juice from grapes in a press. Zetha, observer of immorality; and Karkas, knocker. 33. There was a particular reason why this interruption of the feast took place on the Sabbath. Vashti was in the habit of forcing Jewish maidens to spin and weave on the Sabbath day, and to add to her cruelty, she would deprive them of all their clothes. It was on the Sabbath, therefore, that her punishment overtook her, and for the same reason it was put into the king's heart to have her appear in public stripped of all clothing. 34. Vashti recoiled from the king's revolting order, but it must not be supposed that she shrank from carrying it out because it offended her moral sense. She was not a whit better than her husband. She fairly reveled in the opportunity his command gave her to indulge in carnal pleasures once again, for it was exactly a week since she had been delivered of a child. But God sent the angel Gabriel to her to disfigure her countenance. Suddenly signs of leprosy appeared on her forehead, and the marks of other diseases on her person. 35. In this state, it was impossible for her to show herself to the king. She made a virtue of necessity and worded her refusal to appear before him arrogantly. "Say to Ahasuerus, O thou fool and madman, hast thou lost thy reason by too much drinking? I am Vashti, the daughter of Belshazzar, who was a son of Nebuchadnezzar, the Nebuchadnezzar who scoffed at kings, and unto whom princes were a derision, and even thou wouldst not have been deemed worthy to run before my father's chariot as a courier. Had he lived, I should never have been given unto thee for wife. Not even those who suffered the death penalty during the reign of my forefather Nebuchadnezzar were stripped bare of their clothing, and thou demandest that I appear naked in public. Why, it is for thine own sake that I refuse to heed thy order. Either the people will decide that I do not come up to thy description of me, and will proclaim thee a liar, or, bewitched by my beauty, they will kill thee in order to gain possession of me, saying, Shall this fool be the master of so much beauty?" 36. The first lady of the Persian aristocracy encouraged Vashti to adhere to her resolution. Better, her adviser said, when Ahasuerus's second summons was delivered to Vashti, together with his threat to kill her unless she obeyed, better the king should kill thee and annihilate thy beauty, than that thy person should be admired by other eyes than thy husband's, and thus thy name be disgraced, and the name of thy ancestors. 37. When Vashti refused to obey the repeated command to appear before the king and the 127 crowned princes of the realm, Ahasuerus turned to the Jewish sages, and requested them to pass sentence upon his queen. Their thoughts ran in this wise: If we condemn the queen to death, we shall suffer for it as soon as Ahasuerus becomes sober, and here's it was at our advice that she was executed. But if we admonish him unto clemency now, while he is intoxicated, he will accuse us of not paying due deference to the majesty of the king. They therefore resolved upon neutrality. Since the destruction of the temple, they said to the king, Since we have not dwelt in our land, we have lost the power to give sage advice, particularly in matters of life and death. Better seek counsel with the wise men of Ammon and Moab, who have ever dwelt at ease in their land, like wine that hath settled on its lees, and hath not been emptied from vessel to vessel. 38. Thereupon Ahasuerus put his charge against Vashti before the 7 princes of Persia, Karshina, Shethar, Edmatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marcina, and Memucan, who came from Africa, India, Edom, Tarsus, Mursa, Rezin, and Jerusalem, respectively. 39. The names of these 7 officials, each representing his country, were indicative of their office. Karshina had the care of the animals, Shethar of the wine, Edmatha of the land, Tarshish of the palace, Meres of the poultry, Marcina of the bakery, and Memucan provided for the needs of all in the palace, his wife acting as housekeeper. 40. This Memucan, a native of Jerusalem, was none other than Daniel, called Memucan, the appointed one, because he was designated by God to perform miracles and bring about the death of Vashti. 41. When the king applied for advice to these 7 nobles, Memucan was the first to speak up, though in rank he was inferior to the other 6, as appears from the place his name occupies in the list. However, it is customary, as well among Persians as among Jews, in passing death sentence, to begin taking the vote with the youngest of the judges on the bench, to prevent the juniors and the less prominent from being overawed by the opinion of the more influential. It was Memucan's advice to the king to make an example of Vashti, so that in future no woman should dare refuse obedience to her husband. Daniel Memucan had had unpleasant experiences in his conjugal life. He had married a wealthy Persian lady, who insisted upon speaking to him in her own language exclusively. 43. Besides, personal antipathy existed between Daniel and Vashti. He had in a measure been the cause of her refusal to appear before the king and his princes. Vashti hated Daniel, because it was he who had prophesied his death to her father and the extinction of his dynasty. She could not endure his sight, wherefore she would not show herself to the court in his presence. 44. Also, it was Daniel who, by pronouncing the name of God, had caused the beauty of Vashti to vanish, and her face to be marred. 45. In consequence of all this, Daniel advised, not only that Vashti should be cast off, but that she should be made harmless forever by the hangman's hand. His advice was endorsed by his colleagues and approved by the king, that the king might not delay execution of the death sentence, and Daniel himself thus incurred danger to his own life. He made Ahasuerus swear the most solemn oath known to the Persians, that it would be carried out forthwith. At the same time a royal edict was promulgated, making it the duty of wives to obey their husbands. With special reference to Daniel's domestic difficulties, it was specified that the wife must speak the language of her lord and master. 46. The execution of Vashti brought most disastrous consequences in its train. His whole empire, which is tantamount to saying the whole world, rose against Ahasuerus. The widespread rebellion was put down only after his marriage with Esther, but not before it had inflicted upon him the loss of 127 provinces, the half of his kingdom. Such was his punishment for refusing permission to rebuild the temple. It was only after the fall of Haman, when Mordecai had been made the chancellor of the empire, that Ahasuerus succeeded in reducing the revolted provinces to submission. 47. The death of Vashti was not undeserved punishment, for it had been she who had prevented the king from giving his consent to the rebuilding of the temple. "Wilt thou rebuild the temple," said she reproachfully, "which my ancestors destroyed?" 48.